Okay, hello folks. Welcome to the Bandersnatch panel. We're very glad. We are very glad to see you all here, and it's 11:33, so I guess we'll get started with this. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. I guess we'll start at that end and go to this end. We bring a variety of different perspectives to this dissection, so we wanted you to know a little bit about us before we got started. So, Jason?
My name is Jason Hill, and my microphone is definitely working. I like to refer to myself as the Grouch-in-Chief of Choice of Games.
I'm Mary Duffy, and I'm also a Choice of Games person. I was Choice of Games' first employee, which is to say I'm not a founder, but my title now is editor, and Jason is my boss.
And I expect most of the people in this room know about Choice of Games, but for anyone who doesn't, what does Choice of Games do?
We produce interactive fiction.
We publish interactive fiction.
We publish interactive fiction.
Primarily for mobile, but also people play on the web.
That is true. Multiple choice, text adventures, interactive novels is our preferred terminology as opposed to parser or some other format, but yes.
I'm Emily Short. I got started playing text adventures in the 80s with Infocom, was then active on rec.arts.intfiction in the late 90s. I've been doing this basically forever. I worked on Inform text adventure system, and then transitioned into interactive narrative and AI to support those experiences in the game industry, and now am Chief Product Officer at Spirit AI.
I'm Ian Thomas. I am one of the many heads of a company called Tailspinners. There is nobody but heads.
You'd think you would have some tails.
Yeah. We work on story for games in all its forms as an outsourcer for various companies, going in and helping out with dialogue and choices and consultancy and things. I have also worked on Choice of Games. And I've also worked on video-based interactive fiction in the past and consulted on things like The Bunker, if people have come across that. Quite an early experiment for us, anyway. And I'm your correspondent from the 1970s and 80s computer games in the UK period. So the things that Charlie Brooker was trying to show off in this were horrifically flashbacky for me.
And I'm Heather Albano. I've written Branching Path interactive fiction for a number of different companies, first among them Choice of Games, also for Earplay, also for a couple of other games not affiliated with either. So with that introduction, so what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about Bandersnatch first as a product. We are all gamers and we are all critics of some form or another. And so we played this thing and we have opinions. So we're going to talk about the what. And then after that, we're going to talk about the how, because we are also all designers. And there are interesting design choices, both good and bad, that Bandersnatch made that are sort of fun to dig into. I'm going to moderate this with a pretty light hand because we all know what we're doing. So the first question I figure, as a gamer, what did you like and what did you hate? Whoever wants to grab that one first, everyone can.
Point of order, though.
Yes.
Spoilers. Okay, so.
So fair enough. If you're sitting in this room, we are assuming that either you've seen it or you don't mind us spoiling the ever-living crap out of it. If you are not okay with this, this is not the panel for you. Thank you. Though that is a thing that should say. What was that? Okay, yeah, so we started down that end for introductions. I don't know if you want to start with Ian or what'd you like, what'd you hate?
Okay. I actually want to start from a cultural thing slightly. I was saying to these folks earlier, I actually watched it quite late, and that's partly because I was really tired, and partly because everybody else was watching it and buzzing about it for ages in various ways. And the cultural thing I saw at that point, when it first came out and I hadn't seen it, was really fascinating, because there was a whole lot of game designers who had just seen it and gone, this is terrible. This is stuff we were doing 30 years ago. Where's the innovation? This is really uninteresting. And a whole bunch of consumers saying, wow, this is exciting. We've never seen anything like this before. This is fascinating, which is a really interesting disjunction, I think, and maybe should teach us jaded designers and players that we've been involved in actually what's quite a small world for quite some time. Even the game industry, the wider game industry, is quite a small world. And this level of accessibility is actually quite new. And so my first real reaction to it as that was, this wakes a bunch of people up to the concept of interactivity who've never really experienced it or had that feeling before. And for me, that's a pretty major plus, actually. Whatever you think of the structure of it, it was a pretty major kind of cultural shift. And means the prospect of employment for us might go up a bit, you know. So that was my first reaction from that point of view. From the reaction of a gamer, unfortunately, I find it very difficult to disassociate the design side of it from actually playing it these days, because that's my day job. And so I hit it with, again, a cultural thing, which was, oh my God, flashbacks to the 80s, this is great, because I know Charlie Brooker was very much into that sort of thing as well, and all those kind of callbacks and recreations of stuff which happened then. But also, I got very frustrated really early on with the first few choices that just didn't seem to do anything very much, didn't seem to have any immediate consequences, and in some points just railroaded you straight back in again. And I think I would have been frustrated with that as a player as well, rather than somebody who kind of knows how the sauce is made.
So I actually found those early choices, although I thought this is not doing very much, I felt sympathetic to the possible design reasons that they were there, because it felt like we've got a TV audience, we need to get them used to the idea they might even need to pick something, and if they miss and they fail to make a choice early on, we don't want them to, their first experience with this to be, shoot, I missed out on doing something interesting because I didn't really understand the controls. And one of the sort of major thoughts that I had as I was playing through it myself was how carefully they had built something that would feel familiar to television viewers, the way it handles recaps, the way it handles kind of changing audio and those kinds of elements. There was a lot of television craft that went into it, and that's part of what makes it accessible to those kinds of people. So as I think I also kind of experience games now from a very design perspective, and it's hard to separate that analysis out for me as well, but I found myself a little bit more sort of forgiving of some of those elements.
What was the question?
What did you like? What did you hate?
To go off of what Emily just said, it's interesting to think about it in terms of a product that has to teach its players how to play it for something that is, as you were saying, so familiar to us. But it reminds me of something that happens when I did customer support for Choice of Games, when I first started working for them. I would get emails from people basically saying, please put a back button into your games. I picked the wrong choice and I have to do the whole thing over again. And I would, very diligently defend our design of like, there's no wrong options here. We're never going to give you, a choice where something is the wrong one. There are arguably in Bandersnatch explicitly many points at which that's the wrong choice. And so for me, that's an unfamiliar experience. It takes me back to unpleasant experiences playing with choose your own adventure game books, right, where there's explicitly a wrong choice. So it's true that when you first start playing or watching, depending on what you want to say for Bandersnatch, there's no incorrect breakfast cereal, there's no incorrect music, and then you proceed directly into what seems to be the most important choice right off the bat of should I work in the office of Tuckersoft Games or should I work on this at home? And everything about the way the scene is constructed says work at the office. You're going to have all this support that you don't have as an independent game designer. And, well, sure enough, that's the wrong choice. So, yes, I agree with you. And then I'm so frustrated by that particular moment of what it's trying to teach the audience of like, your choices don't matter because what seems obvious to you is wrong. And so, you know, in a game that's trying to do all this layered metaphorical stuff about control and who is influencing this narrative and how do we influence our own lives, that's the first real choice, and it's tricking the audience. And that was such a turnoff to me. Do you know what I mean?
I agree 100%.
100%.
When I hit that first choice and, you know, went into the office and died, you know, it was just like, really, like that's the very first thing as a choice of games in particular that we're like, no. So I recognize the cultural impact that, you know, that it has, and the way that it is being an introduction into the world for a lay person, and that is cool and exciting. But at the same time, it's like, but there's in many ways replicating some of the what I consider to be bad habits that I want to move away from as a design culture, whereas I also respect the fact that it does do a reasonable job of teaching you how to play as you're going and recognizing the TV craft. So, as a designer and as a player, I myself did not care for it, while acknowledging and respecting its significance and its role and the craft that did go into it. Yes. Ambivalent, I guess.
Okay, that's fair. It's interesting. I actually had a different reaction to that first choice and the shortness of the path. I thought it was an interesting design choice because if you have players who've never seen anything like this before, like my dad played it, you know, having an initial obvious choice that has a very short path following to teach you right up front that you're going to be replaying the same scenes and making different choices, I thought was in that context was forgivable. I got what they were doing.
Yeah.
I also found that personally I had a different reaction to the experience as a whole depending on what ending I got. And I feel like that's something that might be interesting to delve into if anybody has opinions about that.
I absolutely do.
Please do.
So again, I mean, I think I enjoyed the piece more than a number of my friends did because the ending that I got was the one in which he winds up being kind of reunited with his mother and sharing in her death on the train. And that to me was a much more thematically resonant ending than many of the other options because I was much less interested in sort of gotcha endings where you know, he fails to make a good game for some silly reason, or you know, the whole thing devolves into this weird murder plot. I felt like the business about you know, what has happened to him in the past and how does he revisit that trauma, think through it again, and have a different reaction to it and sort of process it differently. That was actually a story that was less obvious to tell based on the form. So what I mean by that is I felt like a number of the paths through Bandersnatch were basically things where Brooker was asking questions about free will or about, you know, what does it mean if you have somebody, a player controlling the protagonist, which basically have been asked and re-asked and re-asked and re-asked by one interactive narrative after another. It's almost, you know, sort of the first thing that people do when they realize that this form exists is kind of like, what do we do with this? So what I found most interesting was the case where the story had actually kind of gone beyond that set of tropes into something different.
It's funny. The first ending that I got was the Netflix ending, where you jump to the future, and I was like, "Oh, this is."
Okay, so I got the same ending as you, which so then I reread your blog post last night to be like, "Oh, great, Heather's going to have two panelists who have the exact same opinion about that ending."
That's totally fine.
I agree, though. I think it was an extremely poignant ending, and in a way, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about. Okay, Black Mirror, yes or no. But it was kind of like, if it had been an excellent episode of Black Mirror, if there were such a thing, then choosing to go and die with your mom on the train and feeling like I had an active role in making that decision, that was like a good Black Mirror episode. Again, if we could have such a thing. And I think you said that, I haven't re-looked at the branches, but that's a pretty difficult ending to get. Is that right?
I mean, that just happens to be the ending that I found, but when I was looking at sort of walkthroughs to the different endings, it looked like that was an unusual choice.
Yeah. It felt very natural and not unexpected, and like I could congratulate them on that narrative.
Yeah.
There's something really interesting going on there with those endings, though, I think, which is that each ending almost catapults you into a different universe. In that, in some endings, you are definitely controlled by a person, and that's the kind of narrative setup. In one ending, you're making a movie. Actually, you step out of it and you're the actor, or Stevan, who you're controlling, is an actor on set, which is a totally different universe from the other universes, and then the one where you die with your mother. So there's something really strange about different paths that you're taking, upending the whole fiction of the whole piece, which is interesting from design, but I'm not sure great for the cognition of the player, because the player has built an idea of the world that they're in, and then suddenly you shift it from under them depending on how many replays you do, which is very strange.
I can't be against this because my first released game ever completely does that. Okay. So that's brilliant, you know. No, I mean, I think one. So the possible defense I would build of that is that. That kind of universe switching approach can be something where you're kind of asking the player what kind of story do they even want out of this? What are they interested in? But the trick I feel about in the case of Bandersnatch is that it's hard to actually articulate that agency as a player most of the time. I didn't feel like, although I had ideas about what I wanted to explore, there were only a few points where I really felt like I had the agency to articulate that to the system.
Yeah.
On that particular note, one of the things with choice of games that we really try to focus on is the idea of intentionality, that you have some idea of what the possible consequences of your decisions will be. And for example, that scene where it's like, do you want to, you're in there with the therapist and you get into the fight, and then it's like, jump on your dad or jump out the window. And if you jump out the window, we cut to what you were just talking about, where it's the end of the story and you're an actor that's forgotten the fact that you're an actor. And that complete lack of intentionality, that, like, it was a brick wall, you know, that you hit that was frustrating for me.
There's another element there too, where at various points you can hit a Hobson's choice, where like there's an option and you have to press it. There's no second option, and that's something that does crop up from time to time in choice of games, and I consider that a bug. I mean, generally, right? Yeah. If you have, X number of options and then the player is failing a number of hidden tests such that only one option appears, like there's something went wrong. And I question what that's supposed to do for you as a player in Bandersnatch.
Yeah, and there are a couple of dual choices in there where intentionally they look like the same thing. I mean, they throw tea over computer or destroy computer.
Yeah.
Right.
It's kind of, aren't they the same thing? I don't want to do either of those, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there are some that are explicitly the wrong choice, where if you decide to, I think it's throw the tea on the computer, it immediately brings you to try this again or go back or something like that, which was something I actually hated. I thought that was a cop-out. If you're going to give the player a choice, it should be a choice that goes somewhere.
That said, there are some interesting things in those choices just from an execution point of view. I guess we've all seen old FMV games where you hit a choice and everything stops while you make a decision. So it was quite nice that they had the kind of live feed happening in the background, and that during that the character you were responding to would generally prompt you and put a bit more pressure on, which I thought was interesting. But there's also a flaw in that, which is it's like the choices out of Walking Dead, where you have 3 choices actually, left, right, or fail to act. Bandersnatch had that as well, but didn't really seem to do anything with the fail to act option, other than, I think, from what I could see, pick one of those 2 choices invisibly, which was just a bit strange, because it meant that you could just sit through it and sit back and watch the whole thing, and it kind of loses the point a little to me. It makes you feel like you're not in control of anything. So, but the continuing loop video was a nice.
So you would have liked to see some built-in consequences for failing to act.
I would like to see option 3.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all want to see option 3. And as you know from having written for Choice of Games, you'll get a note from your editor saying, this is a do nothing option. Why do you have a do nothing option? Give me a reason you're going to do nothing. I don't know if Telltale has really incorporated that into their fail to act as explicitly, but we like to see that intentionality of, I will say nothing because.
I think there is a different emotional effect between, in the choice of case, like you have as much time to sit there and think about what you want.
For sure.
And so it's, failing to act means something different if you've been able to think about, I'm going to be inactive and that's my choice.
Right.
Whereas if, you're sort of sitting there and you're troubled by the question and you're having a hard time making up your mind, or you somehow don't really want to commit and your time is running out, that feels different.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit more patient with it in a timed context. And I think it's more expressive, actually.
Yeah, more than, I think the pressure is really important, and the pressure is really interesting. So it wasn't so much that I want a third option to press, it was more, I want there to be a consequence for your failure to act.
Not acting.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I almost wonder if there could have been a hidden ending, as it were, that you had to get to through failing to act.
Doing nothing the entire game.
Yeah.
Or either, yes.
And I guess we should talk about the flashbacks as well, because they were really super effective. I thought the going back through the loop and shortcutting all those sequences and seeing the results of some of your choices in those, I thought worked really well. Brought it into a cinematic form, a TV form, really well. But there was never any attempt to explain in the fiction how that happened. I mean, if you look at something like Life is Strange, that reversal, that going back through choices is very explicitly laid out in the world. In this one, it's just kind of, so we started the game again. How? How are we repeating this loop? Oh, some of the things I did in the last loop apply to this loop. That's cool, but what? It just lost me as a player. Yeah, lost me as a player. What is the fiction? What's the in-fiction reason for this strangeness?
Did you get to Colin's rant about that?
Yes.
I'm not sure I did.
When you do drugs with him.
Oh yeah.
So Colin, so there is an in-story explanation, kind of. I don't know. That's a strong word for it, but I think they were trying to gloss it. I don't know. I'm struck by how differently I reacted to it emotionally, depending on which of the endings I happened to strike. I didn't get death first, although it's my favorite because I agree with the emotionally resonant. I got History Repeats Itself, where Pearl ends up finishing the game, which I actually thought also worked as a Black Mirror episode in a very different way, that it was very intellectually clever rather than emotionally resonant. But I'm good with either ending. The one that annoyed me to death was the Netflix one, it struck me as the kind of thing you write at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're a bit blocked and it seems funny at the time, and then they left it in.
You should know to be embarrassed by that later.
I was listening to Charlie Brooker on Script Notes the other night talking about that, and that wasn't supposed to be a main choice. That was supposed to be a bit of an Easter egg, and they went through testing and decided to put it in. So it was written as a...
So as an Easter egg, I would have a lot more... I'd give it a lot more leeway as an Easter egg.
But it ended up being one of the main endings.
I know. I know, and that's a bad choice. I don't know. So I have the experience where I'm being annoyed by the self-referential of that ending. And then I found the government control path, which Stevan mentions he just hacked in that weekend. And the whole feel of that path felt to me like they'd hacked it in that weekend. And that was when I started to wonder how deliberately the creators were commenting on different types of interactive fiction. And I go back and forth on whether I think they were being that meta. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that. No,
I suspect not. I suspect that they, despite the fact that Charlie is a game critic and has been a game critic for a long time, I suspect that they haven't read that deeply enough into the various types of interactive fiction to be that explicit about it. I think a lot of it, the impression I got was they wrote a huge tree in twine from description I hear about writing it, and then chopped lots of bits off when they realized it wouldn't fit into production, actually.
I mean, this is the part where, you know, we as game designers and publishers start to get pissy, is because, you know, I read this interview with Charlie Bruckner, and he said something in it like, so we're going along, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to do this, and then we thought, what if it could remember what you had chosen before? And was it you or Dan who said they saw something on Reddit that was like, why is it that every so often some billionaire comes into whatever industry and thinks they can reinvent the wheel, or that there is a wheel to be reinvented? And I think, I mean, you know, we feel like our toes are stepped on, whether that's a legitimate feeling or not, I don't know. But it's like, okay, you obviously Googled enough about interactive narrative to find twine.
And to find GitLamp.
And to find GitLamp, yeah. And then you either stopped or you spent some time looking at our product. You forewent a licensing deal with Choose Your Own Adventure, or they forewent a licensing deal with you. I mean, my question to the panel is, how many people, when they were watching Bandersnatch and heard the boy, their young man, you know, the PC, say, it's a Choose Your Own Adventure book, went, no, it's not. No, it's not. TM.
I believe ChooseCo has filed suit, actually.
Yeah, I know. They filed suit, like, you know, 2 weeks after it premiered.
Yeah, that's a trademark term. You don't do that.
So, yeah, I mean, you know, it's frustrating to have somebody who works in, you know, the television industry say, look at how clever I am.
Yeah, I think that happens, as you say, though, in almost every industry.
Right.
And is really irritating for everybody repeatedly. I've lost track of the number of times I've seen a headline saying the BBC have come up with this great new innovative interactive fiction thing, and it happens about every 5 years, and they still get the headlines, and it's still about as innovative as 30 years ago. So just...
So my
sadly.
question for you then is, I really enjoyed Bandersnatch on a level of watching TV, which is to say it had this really moody early 80s Thatcherian kind of, you know, dystopian feel to it. And that was, you know, I love the art direction. It's fun for me. It's fun for me to watch a show about a game designer. Like, come on, that's fun. How did you feel that it portrayed the era?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Not quite enough cigarette smoke, but
Right.
other than that, yeah, it's, as I said, flashbacks earlier for me. And I think it's very fictional. There were some bedroom coders who were able to create those things in that sort of circumstance, but they weren't 10 a penny. You know, it was very fictionalized, but it had all the essence from it. And again, that's Charlie Brooker all over, and that, I think, is what has driven a lot of his Black Mirror in general. Is the roots of it come from that era, I think, where you were quite hopeful about how everything would turn out because everything was terrible at that point. And look at how we're doing now, 30 years on, and where technology has taken us.
On the other hand, do you feel like he's kind of like Tales of the Unexpected, what if phones but too much?
Yeah, I think pretty much every episode is taken from something like that.
Yeah.
Well, so this all makes me want to ask you what you would do differently. But before I do that, were there any design choices that you thought were particularly good? Moving like from no longer viewing it as a whole, as a product, but looking at individual technical choices. Was there anything that stood out to you as they did that very well?
So I said earlier that in general, I felt like I wasn't able to have agency and direct the story towards the elements that I was most interested in. But there were a couple of places where that was not true. And one that I found particularly effective was the kind of locked safe situation where the story presents you with the protagonist's father's safe, and there are different sort of storylines that could lead you to think that different things might be inside. You might think that it's about this government control program. You might think that it contains something that's quite personal. And you're offered options about what combination to use to unlock the safe. And it presents itself as though it's a puzzle and as though you're supposed to solve it by knowing what the combination ought to be based on what's happened previously. But actually the choice, like all of the combinations, are words that connect somehow to what's been going on in the story. So the choice that you're really making is, what do I think is important enough to be the thing that might be in the safe at this moment? And so although it disguises itself as a puzzle, it's actually assaying your sort of, you as a player care about what, or you think what is the thematic importance of this moment. And that I thought was quite cool. And the fact that they explicitly, it actually works better than it would have worked if it were a safe where you had to, in a kind of parser game, type in your answer, because it's making it really clear there are potentially multiple right answers. And if you revisit that choice point, having come through different avenues of the story, you're actually offered different combination solutions, which lead then on to different discoveries in the safe. So that I really liked.
And it'd be nice to see a little bit more of that, I think. I think that's kind of what the fight sequence about as well, is that what type of game are we playing?
Yeah.
It'd be really nice to see a bit more of that. Now, slight sideways to that was listening to them talk about the puzzle, about the numbers. There's the phone number hidden away in that, which was supposed to be the puzzle. It was supposed to be the major thing in the game. And at one point, Netflix said, "So, how are you going to localize this?" And then they went, things like the word two, which is supposed to be the number 2, but is actually the letter T-O-O. So it wasn't the major puzzle after that.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. That's, wow.
Yeah, I actually only just got to that particular moment in a playthrough this week where you had to
With the
type
phone
in
number?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I managed to misenter it through clumsiness and get it wrong.
In playtesting, just not enough people were getting the number. So they had to be much more explicit about it and retire that as the main puzzle, from what I gathered from the script notes.
Wow. I should not be astonished, but I am disappointed that no one in the, that's a big organization. No one in the business office said, this is going to be translated into other languages where the word two is not a, Yeah, wow, okay.
But the impression I got about the whole thing, actually, and it's worth listening to if anybody's listened to Script Notes, which is the podcast with John August. So they interviewed Charlie Brooker about Black Mirror in general on the last episode. But it was interesting because I think, again, another reaction that a bunch of game designers had was, well, look, they've chosen to do interactive fiction, so of course they're pulling in all the tropes you get from interactive fiction. And the impression that I get from that was actually the other way around. Netflix said, would you like to do this interactive fiction? They went, no, we don't want to go. It's really nice, but we want to leave that. And then came up with an idea about a Black Mirror episode involving control and agency, and then did it the other way around. And went, oh no, this has to be interactive. We didn't really want it to be. Oh well. And then, as I said earlier, took Twine, built this massive, massive tree, and then production reality hit that massive tree. And so what we've got left is really a very sparse impression of what the original structure was supposed to be. Because, as we all know, having again been through this loop over 30 years or whatever, the combinatorial explosion just doesn't work for filmed content, really.
Well, and I mean, especially if you are allowing yourself to branch every time you have any interesting idea about where things might go, whether or not it belongs in the story, which is something I felt was really going on here.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes, that's
I've been trying to grapple with that a little bit and like the quote unquote limits of film. And I was interrogating Jason over breakfast because he's from Los Angeles and knows a little bit about the film industry. And I was trying to say, okay, but for a regular movie that's been scripted, they might have a script that shoots at 4 hours and then they cut that down Like, why don't those economies work for this? And, you know, of course there are reasons, but I'm not quite wrong either. And it made me wonder, like, why didn't they structurally do more with what we call failing forward, in terms of being able to, if you think in choice script, you might have a choice with 3 options. Each option is testing a certain stat or a certain, you know, maybe Boolean so a past thing that you've already chosen, and it tests it. And then so you have 6 different outcomes on success and failure. Couldn't you do like 2 minutes of film for 6 different outcomes just to, do you know what I mean? Like, they weren't even thinking on that level of structure. So to me, it was like, okay, sure, it's expensive as hell to shoot a bunch of different outcomes, but if you can write something that fails forward or succeeds forward and just tests little moments here and there, then you could have something that felt a little more meaningful.
I think possibly inexperience of the production team doesn't help on that, but they were also saying that they tried to record a scene and then a bunch of different lines to plug into that scene, and found that they just completely lost the emotion of the scene because they didn't know where it was going. So they actually had to record the scene 6 times instead of the scene once and then 6 lines. So
It's easier to drop a variable in when you're talking about text
Yeah,
than it is.
yeah.
That's fair.
But that's also down to actors being used to dealing with. You know, if we were to take somebody into the studio to do voice lines for a game, and they're an experienced game actor, they will know how to do that and to be able to offer those options.
They can shade themselves.
But they're not using game actors for filming Bandersnatch.
Right. So we're kind of moving naturally into these are newbies in the field, and we are people with experience in the field, and they should have hired us because we've done this before. What would we have done differently?
Except, just to caveat that,
all right,
most of us aren't experienced film or TV makers, and we're also not used to writing for a film or TV audience. So I don't think it's fair to say they're the newbies, we should have done it. I think it's probably fairer to say we should have combined forces.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. But I do think we were talking earlier about them reinventing the wheel, and I think there was a lot of real wheel reinventing that didn't have to happen because the expertise exists, right? So if anyone sitting on this panel was going to create a thing like Bandersnatch or edit a thing like Bandersnatch, what would you do differently? Where are the opportunities that weren't taken advantage of?
The first thing that I would do, and this is a question that I don't know about their process, but continuity testing is for me incredibly important. And you know, on this last playthrough that I did of Bandersnatch, I played through intentionally leaving Colin alive, and then it forced me to kill Colin, and then he came back to life. And I was like, well, is that a continuity error, or was that just jumping through multiplicities? You know, because of the weird, and those sorts of questions. Unfortunately, and I think about this in terms of our own games, where sometimes you don't know what the intention is, and it reads as a continuity error because it feels like it is, regardless of whether or not it was actually the intention of the author.
Yep.
And so you need to, if you're going to have a moment like that, you need to make sure to explain it so that it doesn't read as a continuity error.
Yeah, I think for me it would be about going off in all the different directions that you folks were talking about, which is all of these different endings and all of these different potential universes, is a great playground, but it means that your content is so wildly different on the different branches.
Yep.
If you're producing a whole lot of content which is supposed to, if you narrow it down to try and make it feel coherent and cohesive, and you have one reality, if you like, I think you can put a lot more variance into the choices, but you can also, in terms of the continuity errors, do it almost like choice of games chapters, where you can steer back in at a node later on, and it still feels like it's all part of the same experience. And I think they also did it was a little kind of rod for their own backs, which is they designed it to be replayed, which is cool because it lets you show off the replays. But as I think we all know from playing things like, again, Telltale or choice of games or whatever, the first time you play it, it can feel like the game's really respecting your choices. And it's not until you play it the second time that you notice that choosing that option actually was the same whichever way you did it. And so to a certain extent, they shot themselves in the foot by having quite a sparse tree and forcing you, as part of the gameplay, to replay it at least once, and then you get to see how sparse that tree is, which is kind of a shame. The illusion's shattered a little bit.
I think even if they did have that structure, if they had made sure that the disparate paths that are rejoining contain something that cast a different emotional light or a different narrative context on what follows, that would still feel meaningful. So you can get away with it. So I think my main thing would be really kind of to say, let's drill down on, like, of this buffet of themes in this draft, like, which of these do you actually care about? Let's focus on that. Let's spend some time making sure that more of these choices are either structured in a way that lets the player feel sort of thematic agency, which, as I said, is one of the most interesting things from my point of view about how it, where it is successful, or else where there's a better understanding of what the stakes of the choice probably are. And I think if they narrowed the multiplicity down a bit so that it was easier to build kind of a mental model of what is the possibility space of where we're going here, then you'd get a lot more sense of intentionality at more of the choice points.
That was what I was trying to say, but you were far better at it.
Yeah. And to go back to someone who will express things far worse than just were expressed, I think that was especially true for me on the levels of intentionality that weren't operating at these choices that seem to be all about mental illness. And I was like, what? Like, for instance, you have an option at one point to take your meds or flush them. And then on a successive replay, you come back around to it and you can flush them or you can throw them away. And I'm sitting there, trying to puzzle that one out. And I'm thinking, okay, well, if I throw them away, my dad might find them in the trash and he'll know that I haven't taken my meds. So then that will make something else happen. And then if I flush them, then the evidence is gone. And you are smarter than the game. And so you're trying to think through this thing. And then on top of that, they're doing something with mental illness that I didn't particularly appreciate. So, like, if you're going to give me binary choices, make sure that they do something. If it's a yes/no, I want the yes/no to do something. But also, please don't give me choices that are like, take your antidepressants or don't take your antidepressants.
Yeah.
So I think I might do more to the story than I would even to the design.
Yeah, that's very valid.
But going back to those choices again, I think there were a whole bunch of occasions where you wanted a different possibility. You mean
yes.
the throw or the flush or those kind of things. And I think...
Yes, or fuck yes.
The one I particularly hated was you can say yes or no when Colin offers you the harder drugs. And if you say no, he spikes your drink. And I have, I think, never been quite so angry at a fake choice. I chose for you is the line, and I'm like, that's bad design, that's bad writing, that is appalling social commentary, that just fails in every possible.
It's a fictional violation of consent that goes with the mechanical.
Yeah.
I didn't know that would happen because I've never turned down drugs.
Nicely said. And in fact, I think they were banking on the fact that 90% of the players are not going to turn it down for a variety of reasons. It's the most interesting choice in the scene. Let's do it and see what happens, right?
Again, that's the problem with their intentionality and their design is they make one much more attractive than the other. And then they either reward you or punish you for picking the most attractive one. And I'm not interested in being punished, and I'm not even really that interested in being rewarded.
But then say, it's okay because meta framework,
because meta.
which is
Right.
which is
And
the
this-
get out clause for the whole thing, which is a shame.
We can do better than that, is what I think it is, really.
Yeah.
One of the interesting...
They had a virgin's enthusiasm, right?
Yeah, but, I don't know. I feel, I have some pretty strong feelings about some of the where it falls down in the social way. So the first time I got the take your meds or don't take your meds, I got to it from the path where Colin has ranted about people controlling you by putting stuff in your food, in the context of the government control path, which is not well executed and is not believable. But in that context, deciding to throw your pills away makes a lot of sense. It's a story reason. Oh, okay, sure, let's see what happens.
You're being cleverer than the story.
I might be.
Yeah.
The second time I got to it, I did not have the context of the Colin explanation. It was just I'd come from my psychiatrist's office. And so I took the meds, and then I failed to finish the game. And the game that I created, the game that Stevan created, was not well received. And so explicitly connecting antidepressants to loss of creativity is incredibly irresponsible. So yeah, I was pretty disappointed by that.
Did anybody else make a connection that when your dad takes you to the psychiatrist's office, that he drugs you? Because you know how the PC is asleep in the car?
Oh,
He's
yeah.
like, let's go to lunch. And then they're like, and he gives you tea right before you go to lunch. And then he gets in the car and you wake up and it very much feels like time has passed. And then you're like, oh, where am I? And he's like, we're at the doctor's office. You have to go in there. And I was like, we're never dealing with the fact that your dad just freaking drugged you.
Now I'm curious to know who else read it that way, because that didn't occur to me. The way I was reading was he's been up for 48 hours and he fell asleep in the car. So his dad tricked him, but didn't. Did the rest of you read it as drugged?
I didn't, but I may have missed it.
Yeah? Okay.
Okay, I missed that too. I assumed we had gone to lunch and were in the car after lunch, or I fell asleep in the car and we didn't go to lunch at all.
That was how I read it,
Yeah.
was that he'd fallen asleep just from fatigue. But certainly being drugged that's upsetting, yeah.
But he's a government agent, right?
Well, maybe not. You haven't established that path yet. Yeah.
I think it's quite interesting that we've been sitting here kind of listening, and we're doing that thing where we're talking about Stevan being us, actually, rather than that whole separation of control thing that they're trying to go for. So the separation of the control thing doesn't seem to be quite working, because we're all saying that bit when your dad does whatever, which is interesting as well. Because a lot of the intentionality and the choices and the reactions, there is that section where you're poking Stevan to do things and he is getting fed up of the voices in his head and is starting to try and do something else, which is an interesting idea but wasn't very well executed, I think.
Well, you're bringing up something too that we were talking about as a team. We have this phenomenon where, you can play a Choice of Games title or another piece of interactive fiction, and then you don't really know how wide it is until you've played it twice or maybe 3 times. But a lot of our customers have a canonical playthrough.
Yep.
A canonical playthrough. And I feel like, for me, I don't know if it was true for Emily, I kind of have my canonical playthrough.
Yeah.
So it is hard for me to go back and play it again and explore and just, poke at it for different endings, because I have one that was good.
I went back and played it some more, but it was definitely from the point of view of this one was the true one, and then we'll go see what's going on.
Mm-hmm. But because I identify so strongly with the character, it is Stevan, but you do say your dad, and when you do this, and when you throw away your meds.
Yeah, and I just heard myself say I didn't finish the game, and then realized I had to clarify.
You didn't finish writing Bandersnatch, the game within the game.
Indeed. Indeed, yes.
I think so. On the kind of what are the social messages piece of this, also, I found the mental illness aspects troubling. To a lesser degree, I also really missed. I think there was a missed opportunity to go as far as they could have done with the friendship with Colin, because it felt like he was a really interesting character, and the kind of possibility of comradeship in a difficult emotional space and in a difficult creative space is really important. And it kind of is a possible resolution for a lot of the things that are afflicting the character. And the fact that they take you partway down that road and then they say, oh, he drugs you, or you accept his drugs, and then things go haywire and there's this weird forced jumping off a balcony scene. I felt like there was something false about that, like emotionally false about how the world works, that made me upset. Like, and it bothered me because it felt like we got to this point because they thought it would be shocking or because they felt like they had to show you having a bad result for taking drugs. Where really, like, what's led up to that space is you go to this guy's house, he says, I understand where you are, you're in the hole, I'm here to help you. And it feels like it's an opening to emotional intimacy and connection and understanding intellectually what's going on in this challenging project that you're working on. And you want to say yes to that. And it really bothered me that the story was like a hard no, and a hard no not for a good reason.
Yeah, Colin was really troubling for me on that level too, because he has his rant where he's getting all metafictional for you, but he's also, and I say this as someone who, is interested in this field, is he's saying about LSD, which is I assume what they're supposed to be taking. He doesn't explicitly say, but he says you'll see the whole picture. And that is literally true. They use LSD for terminal cancer patients to help them come to grips with their own death in guided sessions, and that is what they all say. I saw the whole picture, I wasn't afraid to die. And so he's like, wow. He's pulling in things that are actually true about psychotropic drugs, and then it ends in this business of him being like, okay, and after all that shit that I just said, one of us is gonna die right now because it doesn't matter. I didn't even believe it for him as a drug user or, experiencer of the doors of perception or whatever you wanna say. And that was really emotionally false to me too.
Yeah.
I mean, whatever you think of drugs, it was emotionally false.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that we're all kind of circling around the same topic of sincerity, which says to me that if we were going to do it, all of the endings would be more sincere, maybe. I think that's what I would do differently if I were writing it, that I was genuinely emotionally affected by the death ending. And to a lesser extent, actually, this was a subtle point, but you can still choose to go with your mother or not go with your mother when you're back at that point. There's a bit at the very beginning where you're talking about your mother's death and the psychiatrist says, you didn't know. And so being back there and picking, no, I'm not getting on the train, and knowing what's going to happen is also a very interesting emotional moment. I would have liked to have seen them do more of that. Like, that got me, both of those things. And you're talking about the other points of emotional connection that they bypassed in favor of, let's do the Netflix ending. So it could have been so much more than it was as a story.
Yeah.
And that's where I got disappointed.
But I think it's interesting that we've been talking for nearly an hour on something, as opposed to any other episode of any of the other things out there. Clearly it worked in at least one level, I think.
I also think it's interesting that as you frame it as a Bandersnatch episode, you frame it as an intro to interactive fiction, and then you frame it as an experience for an experienced gamer. You get very different, like the lenses are very, very different. I continue to think that it is structured very well for a player who's never encountered this. That it does a lot of teaching in, like, this is again a subtle point, and I could be, again, being more clever than the designers, but the new player and the completionist player, like if you know you're doing every path, you tend to start on the left hand of the screen every time, and if you follow the left-hand path, like at the beginning, it gives you like the shortest baseline and then pops you right back up to do something with a different perspective. Mosaic did that too, actually. So I think that on some level, they're playing consciously with people's defaults, which I respect a great deal. We've been talking for almost an hour about this. I think we have 5 more minutes. Does that sound right to people? We have 5 more minutes? You want to take a couple audience questions?
Yes.
All right.
It's funny because I was when I was replaying it this week, I wanted to follow through all the leaves of an individual branch, if you will, and I was frustrated to that degree where it would take me farther back and then I wanted to go and not let me explore all of those leaves. That said, I thought that the recap in particular was the best part. Like, that was a really that was I want to say an innovation. I could be wrong, but I feel like it was an innovation. It's not something that I'd seen before that I think will probably become a gold standard for this type of format in the future. But the choice points, that's a little more ambivalent about.
Interesting. I think Charlie Brooker was writing what he knows again, which is a fundamental kind of starting point. And I think again it's mapping onto what people might expect, in that if you are going for something which is completely, which is not about games, then in some way you have to say, and you have choices, and in the fiction, this is why you have choices and this sort of thing. By choosing computer games, I think there's a huge game-playing audience out there, and I think it very obviously leads on to, and there are some choices in this because it's about computer games. I think if you'd chosen it to be about doctors or something, yes, obviously you could put choices in, but it's far less Black Mirror kind of fit, really. It just feels like a pretty close theme to what they were trying to go for.
And I agree with you, and I think part of an observation that I would make to go alongside that is that we see games being used to explain some of those structural tropes, even in stories that are not primarily about games. So I'm thinking of Russian Doll here, like where you're using the game theme to explain what's going on in that show, which I didn't say I was going to spoil, so I'll just leave it there.
I agree. That's something that I fully admit to struggling with, not with regards to antidepressants as such, though I do take those, but I have the misfortune of needing to take prednisone from time to time, and it's legal speed, and I do so well on it, and I feel so great, and it's always a literal adrenal come down to go off of my prednisone. But we'd be lying if we didn't say that there was a trope or a lived experience of creativity and madness and, mania and creativity, in whatever form it takes. But you have to be responsible about it. And they clearly weren't. And we were all disappointed.
Yes, we absolutely were. Well, it is 12:30, so I think we should probably wrap this up. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, panelists. You guys were great.